In this video, I'm going to show you my version of the very popular DIY construction grade lumber table. This table is breakdownable but still uses solid joints, so it's nice and sturdy. And this first part is going to show you making the table base. I'm starting this project off with some Douglas fir 4x4s. These Douglas fir 4x4s are at my Lowe's. You could see they come really straight. They're very true. Now with construction grade lumber, you want to build with it pretty quick because it will move on you quickly if you let it sit around. So the first thing I did was cut it into more manageable sizes. This is going to be a 36-inch tall table, so I just cut these, I think, to about 38. And I sent them through my planer. Now I do this kind of often where I press start at the wrong time, so I didn't get planing those beams, but I basically just took off a little bit on each side. You could see the before and after here of how nicely it cleans up those beams. I don't take a ton off. It's maybe 1/8 of an inch on each side. So once I had that done, I squared off my edges so I had one nice square edge to work with. I don't cut these to final length until I make sure the tabletop glues up at the thickness I want. So I'm joining all these pieces with mortise and tenons. They're on the shallow side for mortise and tenons, so I'm going to be reinforcing them with bed bolts, which also makes this table collapsible. So I ended up planing a bunch of extra lumber for when I planed the lumber for the tabletop. So this is also Douglas fir, and I cut it into strips. To attach all the pieces, there's going to be aprons on the top like a traditional table, as well as a stretcher on the bottom. Just because these legs are so thick and this table's so tall, you're going to want something on the bottom to hold everything in place. So I marked out, this is the bottom that's going to get cut, so I marked to what it should be, which is 34, and then I could cut it there. I came up about 4 inches, and I marked a mortise. Now my aprons and my stretchers are going to be 3 inches thick by the thickness that I have left, which is about 1 3/8 inches. So I marked center, and then I want a 3/4 inch mortise, so I drew that, and then up top I did the same thing. I marked center, 3/4 inch mortise, but up top I don't want it to go all the way through. I want to have 4 sides for my glue joint, so I'm going to make that a little bit shorter of a mortise. Last fall I built this mortising jig, and that is what I'm going to use to put all the pieces in, and I have a detailed video of the build of this and how it is used on my channel, so I'm not going to get into huge depth on it here. So this jig probably looks a little complicated, but it's really not. You just set up some stops on the bottom that these pieces sit on, and then align those fences on top to cut perfect mortises every time. I love this jig. It's really easy to use. I actually don't think I've used it since I made it, and it was easy to line everything up. Everything stayed true, and to still use it. You could see that once you have it set up for one mortise, you could cut identical mortises on all your pieces, and it goes by pretty quickly. Now if you don't have a mortising machine like this, or even a commercial grade one, before I had this machine I used to cut these on my drill press. I made a fence for my drill press. That was even before I had the drill press table, and it was quite similar. I made some stops and then drilled them all out that way. So once I had all my mortises, it was time to cut my tenons, and these boards ended up being the space in between is about 15 3/4, and I made a 3/4 inch tenon on either end, so 15 3/4 plus 1.5 inches. And I'm just gauge these off of my table saw fence. I raise that blade up 3/4 of an inch, and I have a tenoning jig, which is basically just a vertical piece of plywood attached to a movable part on my fence, and I could slice through and create the tenon that way. So by flipping it, it creates 2 completely even grooves, and then I just cut off that excess shoulder material with my miter gauge, and then you have a nice simple tenon. And then once you have all this set up, it's the same thing. I could go through and cut all those tenons. So since my mortise holes are rounded and my tenons come out square, I just take a utility knife and shave off the corners of my pieces to round them up. This is really easy to do on pine, and then you could see I have a nice tight fit in my joints with no gaps or anything like that, which is what you're looking for with these mortise and tenons. So then in order to make the one on the other side that's a little bit shorter, I just use my quick square as a depth gauge to mark how far down I had to go, and I could cut that vertical on my tenoning jig by just lining it up with the blade. Once I had all those cut, I could just rip off that little piece the same way I did making the tenons, and then you could see the dry fit. Everything fits together nice and snug, not too tight. So this tabletop has a fairly large cantilever on top so that you can fit some stools on either end. So my aprons on top, I wanted to cantilever off the legs to have some support for the tabletop. So I'm cutting some fairly large bridle joints on the top edge of these boards. I'm going to have the same material that Douglas fir going through, which at this point after planing is about 1 1/8 inches. So I cut down 3 inches and made that little, almost like an open mortise. And then to make my life easier by removing the material, right now I'm just drilling into the bottom of that hole, and I could take out that large chunk. After that's done, I could clean it up with the chisel. So now I have a nice deep joint on the top edge of all of my pieces. There's the runner, the apron that's going to go on the top, and this is 50 inches long, and I marked where I wanted it to cantilever. You could see the marks line up with the edge of my pieces, and then I could go through with a square and mark the inner edge as well. So this is the test fit to make sure I have my radial arm saw set up properly to cut those joints. So on my long pieces, I'm cutting very thin dados that are the thickness of my 3x3, which is now a little thinner than 3x3 since I planed it. And you can't see it in the frame, but there's actually a stop on the other edge of this board, so these all come out perfect. I'm cutting them on either side so that this can nestle into that top bridle joint without moving. So I cut all those curves on the radial arm saw, can clean it up with my chisel, and then I use a rasp to really fine tune the whole piece and get nice perfect fits. So now you have a nice solid joint on top that can be taken apart. This is the portion of the piece that if you want to take this table apart, this is where it will come apart. But it won't be able to move. So with this design, those top aprons and the bottom stretcher are the only parts that are going to come apart. So on my 4 corners, I decided to put bed bolts. They're really cheap, they're easy to install, and then they're easy to take out and have this whole thing come apart. So I just had to fine tune that bottom joint so that my aprons sat flush. And then before I finished this, I had the tabletop done, so I cut these legs to final dimensions, which were 34 inches tall. I started by using a pilot hole, which was about a 1/4 inch pilot hole through the center of those top bridle joints. I was going to use this pilot hole to then hand drill the rest of it because I just don't have a bit deep enough for my drill press. Same thing on the bottom. I centered where that mark was going to go, and it was going to come out, you can see, through that center of the mortise. And then I cut all the holes on the bottom like that as well. Once I had all those holes, I dry fit my entire piece together. You could see how nice and easy this goes together with those bridle joints on top. And then I could put all of my side pieces in, get everything aligned, and put it together. I think this is actually the first time I'm showing the dry fit, but that's what it looks like. So now with everything in place, I could take a hand drill, and using those nice vertical holes I already made on the drill press, can mark how far I have to go, because these go fairly far into the table. I think they're like 5-inch bed bolts, and then I could drill those pieces through to depth with the hand drill. So then I actually went through a couple different ways of doing this, but I ended up drilling a little bit bigger of a hole than the 3-inch little nut that comes with these bed bolts. I think I drilled 1/2-inch holes. So you line those up with the holes that are going through your mortise on the other end, and then those bolts just slide right in. I use a Phillips head screwdriver to kind of keep everything aligned while I'm screwing those bolts in. So it's a little easier to see with the top pieces. You can see I have that marker hole for my hand drilling, and then the hole I'm drilling on top is going to go right through the center of that, and I set the depth according to the dimensions of that end bolt. So you go about an 1/8 inch deeper than the hole for the bed bolt, and those two holes then kind of end up perpendicularly, they intersect, and that's how everything fits into place. So then these two end sections are actually getting glued together, and they will not come apart. So this table will come apart in the sense that the tabletop will come off, the aprons on top will come out of the bridle joints, so you'll be left with the tabletop, two aprons, and then those two sides. So these are my two sides permanently glued together. So those bed bolts on the bottom are not unnecessary. I put them in there to reinforce the joints because, like I said, my mortises are not super deep, but those will stay in there permanently. The only bolts that will ever come out are the ones on top. I basically did it a little bit for stability, but also to match. So then before I finally put everything together, you can see I cut little 45s off my apron. So then the final piece I had to make for this was the stretcher on bottom. I made sure that all my legs were perfectly square, got my inner dimensions, which were a little over 25 inches. I added about 3/4 of an inch to that, and then I could cut the bottom stretcher. And then I was going to put two very shallow tenons on it, just like the top, and then I just hand cut off that excess shoulder material. Now this bottom stretcher is also going to be attached with bolts so that this could come out, and you'll have that as a floating piece as well. So then for the inner portion, I just simply marked center, mapped out where that tenon was going to be. I always cut these in pieces, so I will cut the mortises first or the tenons first, and then size the other component off of what I already have cut. And since this is pine, I just hand cut these mortises. I already have them attached to the legs, so putting in a machine or something would have just been a hassle. It was easy to just hand cut these mortises out and fit those tenons. So once I had those fit, I pre-drilled a hole from the inside to make sure that it would be centered, and then I could put this whole piece together. I have that pilot hole already in place, and then I could do the exact same thing. I could hand drill the rest of the way into the tenon on the other piece as a marking gauge. Now for this one, I'm using threaded inserts so that you won't have any holes on the side of your stretcher where you'll see them. So then once I had that pilot hole, I could put that threaded insert in there, and the threaded insert, I put it in deep enough to go past the tenon so I don't have to worry about it splitting. So it goes pretty deep. I don't have the proper bolts for this yet, so I just used some 1/4 inch bolts I had laying around my shop, put that in place, and then I could just, now everything is pretty solid. And those bottom holes on, I don't think you see it in this one, but I end up filling those with dowels since you never have to worry about those coming out. So then to finish up the table, the last bit of structure I added to it were some 45s in the top portion of these pieces. I just cut these out of scrap. I was able to clamp them in place because I have that cantilevered piece of the table, and then just sunk some pre-drilled and sunk some screws in the corners. So now I have a nice solid piece, and the second portion of this video is going to be making the tabletop and doing all the finishing for the piece.